Welcome back, guys. So last year, February, I believe some 20th or 23rd, whatever, I posted a video that was in chronological order of the successive events of the first half of the tribulation. And this particular video had everything to do with the apparent assassination and the false resuscitation or false resurrection of the Antichrist. And considering the current circumstances surrounding the former president and a lot of the unfortunate overly allegorical interpretations that are coming up through modern Christian circles, they're basically trying to pin those verses on this political assassination that's occurring with the former president as somehow being a fulfillment of those verses, all while ignoring the preceding events that the Antichrist has to go through to get up to that point. So just to bring you quickly up to snuff, and I've described these things recently, like within the last 2 or 3 months, the Antichrist basically goes through 2 world wars, one that is centered over Egypt and one that is centered over northern Israel, Syria. And the final result is the utter decimation of the enemies, or the armies rather, of the south, led by the king of the south, the Mahdi, as we've come to discover is really the only option that it could be. And this is also describing the 3 power centers, the 3 horns that the little horn Antichrist in Daniel uproots before him while he's on his rise to prominence, being the largest center of power, the largest horn in the end after these events occur. But there is also very, very, very distinct descriptions both in Daniel and Revelation. We're going to go over those verses here in this video that describe a very literal, not a disparagement or a disheartening of Antichrist, but a very literal attack on his life that appears to cause his physical death, that also is followed by, and we can be certain that this is the truth, that it is legitimately false. I don't believe he actually dies. I believe he gets really close. There are many, many parallels in modern, medicine that could show that somebody could lay dead for a certain period of time, at least scientifically dead, heart not beating, no signs of life, and still be resuscitated. And there is a physical scar left on Antichrist that is very much a sign that it was an actual physical attack, not just an attempt to defame him. So I'm not going to go through all of this information. I'm going to post that previous video in the links here in the notes so that you can go back and see it if you'd like, because I go over verbatim much of what we're going to go over here. I'm going to add some stuff now, because now that we've had this recent unveiling of events, occurrences that are happening right now that are being misinterpreted, I think it's very important to directly address this head on. And I'll say just from the get-go, no, absolutely not what's happening to President Trump, though clearly is nonsense, illegal, unprecedented, a farce, whatever you want to call it. It's also, in my opinion, quite clear that this is all part of the game. And the powers that be that control both him and the other wing of the bird very much have this in mind, so as to, again, create perhaps forward momentum for him to get back into office. We don't know these things just yet, but it all seems too on the nose, in my opinion, and only those who are extremely emotionally invested are going to allow themselves, unfortunately, because of free will, they have the ability to misinterpret these things and try and read the tea leaves all incorrectly and not get into the original languages like we're about to do, so as to bring clarity. So, the apparent assassination and resuscitation of Antichrist. Here's Daniel 11:30. This is an appropriate translation, and then I'm going to go into the reasonings behind the translation so that you can understand. And again, I'll post where this comes from too, so you can do your own study. Don't just take my word for it. I'm just putting my credibility on the line by letting you guys know that this is absolutely true in the way that it is. So here's the translation. Then he will be stricken as if dead, but will revive. Therefore he will be enraged at the Holy Covenant, so that on his return to Israel from the far south, he will take action against it. In other words, this culminates with him eliminating Moses and Elijah and ending the sacrifices of the temple that are going on that hearkened back to Christ's sacrifice. Immediately upon the heels of his dramatic victory over the south, the king of the south, the beast will be the object of an attempted assassination plot, the event that would give him the fatal wound that is nonetheless miraculously healed, Revelation 13:3. The key word in the half verse above is the Hebrew verb form nich'ah. I think I said that right. And again, you'll have to read this to actually be able to study this, but you can look these up in lexicons and see what I'm saying here is true. While there exists a variety of opinions among lexiconographers and commentators about this difficult form, what we have here is most likely what's called the nifal, or the passive perfect, of the verb cha'a, meaning to strike, smite, or scourge. Hence the translation, he will be stricken. Time and space do not here permit a detailed explanation of cha'a. It must suffice to remark that in the Hebrew lexicon, Gesenius, who is a major lexicographer of the past that went through and basically helped bring the Masoretic text to a modern, understandable form that could be exegeted properly for biblical interpretation, and he did a wonderful job. Gesenius likewise derived this form from the you'll have to see it in the writing, unfortunately, but the verb itself is very difficult to describe in English, unfortunately, because it's ancient Hebrew. And that he and the other commentators, notably Zockler and T. Lewis, in the Lang series, also find the nifal form of this verb at Job 30, verse 8, in the form of basically driven, scourged from the land. Gesenius understands the Dagish forte as euphonic. Again, really hard to understand explicitly, but this is part of the difficulty of digging into foreign languages that are long since dead. Translations which take this verb as being used here in a strictly emotional sense, the King James and, well, most modern translations, honestly, i.e. understanding it to mean that Antichrist will be disheartened but not physically injured, do so without any firm evidence. In other words, all the evidence that link that particular verb form to a physical scourging versus an emotional disheartening scourging are out of line. In other words, what we have in Daniel is very much proof that it actually lines up perfectly with Revelation 13:3, not the other way around. The two passages often adduced as parallels, namely Psalm 109:16 and Ezekiel 13:22, both contain the delimiting word heart, which specifies the place affected or stricken, and thus move the application of the blow from the physical to the emotional realm. In other words, this does not exist in Daniel. It only exists in those other two verses. No similar delimiting word is to be found in Daniel 11:30. Therefore, given that the meaning of the root identical to nika'ah likewise means literally to strike or smite, and given the well-known Hebrew phenomenon of related roots often bearing identical meanings, the preponderance of evidence points in the direction of Antichrist being stricken in a quite literal sense, as opposed to suffering a mere psychological setback. Now, the reason why this is important to study, and again, don't take my word for it. Go look these things up. Do your own study. It is not an easy thing to do, rather. It's quite difficult to get to the very basis of this. But the reason why my teacher, the doctor, has gone through all this trouble to describe these things is because of the fact that modern translations in English leave many translations in place, including, for example, verses 1 and 2 of Genesis, where it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and it became ruined and despoiled. Well, that whole description right there really doesn't make sense, because how does God have a perfect, awesome, complete, whole creation in verse 1, and then a completely destroyed and essentially flooded and darkened earth in verse 2 without any reasoning behind the shift between 1 to 2? So our modern translations in English, unfortunately, like to hold on to translations that are traditional and consistent with former translations instead of actually getting to the heart of the matter. In this case, Revelation 13:3 is actually explicitly simple and very, very easy to understand in the Greek, and why I think it's imperative to make sure that if you're trying to find some understanding in one area of the Bible, find its counterpart somewhere else in the depths of the Old Testament where it originally came from. Revelation is actually written with the understanding that the reader has done their due diligence and searched the scriptures already. And that's the reason why it paints so many different figures in broad strokes and doesn't get into specific details, because the assumption is that you are being like the Bereans, doing your research and getting into Zechariah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Isaiah, and so on, so as to fill out the picture and understand, for example, the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. The mountains are specifically very large, powerful countries. They are not actual hills in Rome. There's a very good reason why there's so much misunderstanding for those who like to say the New Testament means New Covenant, which means only for the church. The Old Testament means Old Covenant only for Israel. And they like to separate the two, all while ignoring the Ephesians verses saying we are one in Christ, and very much God has never changed. He was telling the story back during Daniel, the same story he's telling in Revelation. The difference is the reader, or the writer rather, John and the Lord himself, assume, hopefully, that you have done your work and gone back and dug through all the older scriptures that refer to the exact same events that will come about here in the future. And I'll just read those verses from Revelation because it's super simple. Revelation 13:3. And one of its heads, the beast's head, looked as if it had been stricken unto death, and yet its mortal wound had been healed. And that is very simple in the Greek. That is not a difficult study to figure out what those words are actually saying. Revelation 13:12. And he, the beast's false prophet, will act with all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he will make the world and all of its inhabitants worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. In other words, the false prophet is going to use this fake resurrection as some kind of proof that the fake Messiah, the anti-Messiah, the Antichrist, is somehow fulfilling all of the ancient scriptures pointing to him being the Christ and Jesus not actually being the Christ by his mortal wounds. But the fact of the matter is, Christ had a refulgent, awesome, completely reconstructed, eternal body that, of course, had the holes in his hands and feet as a remembrance for what he did. But there was nothing aged, destroyed, scarred, disgusting, or unsightly about the true Messiah, whereas the false one will have the wound on his head, and it will be very obvious to all that he is not the resplendent and deity Son of God, Jesus Christ. Here is Revelation 13:14. And he, the beast's false prophet, will deceive those who dwell upon the earth on account of the miracles, literal signs, which had been given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, even commanding the inhabitants of the earth to make an image of the beast, that is, of him who received the deadly stroke of the sword and yet came back to life. Again, this will be the claim that is made, whether you've taken it upon yourself to accept that he was actually fully killed and brought back to life, whether he was, his body was taken by Antichrist, or by Satan rather, and basically used as a shell. I find that kind of hard to believe, because if that were the case, why is it that Antichrist and false prophet deserve to be thrown right into the lake of fire at the beginning of Armageddon, essentially, if in fact their deeds were not willfully conjured up on their own, with the help of Satan, of course, but they were choosing to follow him. So all the egregious nature of their acts, basically, it earned them an immediate and non-truncated trip directly to hell. They basically got what they deserved because of the extreme amount of evil that they committed. Here's Revelation 17:8, and we'll finish. The beast which you saw was, and is going to rise from the abyss. So in other words, he existed, he came not to exist because he was physically killed. And then just the same way that the revival of Rome on the one hand and the apparent resuscitation rather, of Antichrist on the other, and is going to its destruction. In other words, its final disposition in the lake of fire. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names had not been remained written in the book of life, where they were written from the beginning of the world, will be in awe of the beast, because he existed, and is not, came to not exist, and will again be present on the scene, seem to return to life in the case of Antichrist, and be reestablished in respect to the empire. So again, I don't mean to rain on these people's parades. We need to put the Bible first 100% and not let our feelings dictate what's going on. Not only does someone like Trump absolutely not fulfill any of this because there's no literal attack on his life. Now, if he were to be killed and brought back to life, I guess I'd have something else to say. The problem is the preceding events, the death of Moses and Elijah, the evangelism of the 144,000, the 2 world wars with the king of the south, the fact that there is no established, unified northern versus southern bloc. All of these things happen before this particular set of circumstances come to be. So not only does he not qualify on those grounds, but the political hit job thing it's a farce and it's a lie, and I think it's very imperative that, again, we put the word first. Comment down below, let me know what you think. I'm sure I'm going to hear about this from the detractors. I don't really care, because if they've chosen to not believe the truth of the Bible, that's up to them. But as for you, those who are really trying to stay true to the word, check out the other video I made, because I go through all of this and then some, and actually conclude to the end of the chapter. I'll put the link in the notes, and I'll make sure that video is there so that you guys can see. This is important to remember, and we must not let it go. Let me know what you think. Talk to you soon, guys.